Hello everyone, and welcome to Lecture 4 of our Cold War series. Um, if you recall, in our last lecture, we ended off talking about how the Soviet and American occupation of the Korean Peninsula had ended, and during that time, there's going to be another civil war within Korea. So, the Korean War, September 15th, 1950. 70,000 U.S. soldiers landed in the center of Korea near Seoul in the Battle of Incheon. Now, if you recall, uh, Kim's forces, the communist North Koreans, had pushed the UN troops, including the American soldiers, all the way to the southeast portion of that peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur is going to enter the scene as the commander of UN forces there. And in the Battle of Incheon, which is more towards the center of the country, through an operation called Operation Chromite, MacArthur is going to have an amphibious assault from the western part of the peninsula, totally surprising the North Korean forces. In this battle, they're going to decimate the North Korean forces and send them fleeing far up north into the country. The surprise attack turned the war around for the Americans as the North Korean army fell apart. As those forces fled back across the 38th parallel, the goals of the police action had been accomplished. So, mission accomplished. What the forces came to do was to give South Korea back to the South Koreans and to establish that line of agreement between the Communist North and the more democratic Free South. With UN backing, however, American forces pushed past the 38th parallel in order to reunify Korea. So, if you recall, people in America were very supportive of this war, and the Cold War was going on pretty hot and heavy, and so people supported the idea of liberating these people from the communist forces. But as we'll see, things are going to intensify because of that. By November 24th, 1950, so after just essentially a couple of months, the UN American Army had made it to the Chinese-Korean border at the Yalu River, so they managed to take the Korean peninsula. 2 days later, however, China sent around 300,000 troops into Korea. So the Chinese had warned that if they felt that their border was threatened, or if they felt that American troops were going to enter into China, that they would attack. So by coming all the way up to the border, the Chinese decided to hump out their communist friends in Korea and launch this assault. Alright, here we have a battle of U.S. Marines in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. In this battle, this represented a lot of pockets of U.S. soldiers and Marines that were surprise attacked by the Chinese forces as they crossed the Yalu River. So, the Chinese invasion shocked U.S. and UN forces, as many units were surrounded and overrun. U.S. casualties were as high as 12,000, while the Communists lost over 3 times that many men. Now, this represents the type of warfare that the Chinese were using at this time. Though they had antique weapons, and many of their soldiers didn't even have guns, they just had essentially crude bombs and hand grenades. Their forces would tie tourniquets around their limbs so that in case they were wounded, they could fight on. They were told to get in as close to the enemy as possible, even if it meant to detonate themselves. So, U.S. forces faced wave after wave of fearless fighters within these battles. Over the next 3 weeks, UN and U.S. troops were pushed back to the 30th parallel. As you recall, that was the intentional target in the first place. MacArthur, however, called for a bombing of the bridges along the Yalu River, even with atomic weapons. So his idea was to totally irradiate the border between Korea and China so that people couldn't even live there, much less cross through there safely for hundreds of years. He also called for a naval blockade of China, and they didn't really have a navy at that time, so that would have been it would have been mostly just to stop any trade coming in and out of China. And he used Chinese nationalist forces to attack mainland China. If you recall, the Chinese nationalist forces were exiled to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, and so this was seen as an attempt, well, MacArthur wanted an attempt in order to take the country away from the communists. President Truman, however, allowed him to use conventional bombs, not atomic weapons, along those bridges in order to halt that Chinese avenue of approach. But he didn't want to use atomic bombs, and he didn't want to start a war inside of China because he wanted to avoid World War III. Because he knew that if they would have launched a war into China itself, it would have possibly provoked the Soviets, who now had atomic weapons of their own. To avoid further conflict, Truman decided to abandon the reunification of Korea and to an end of the conflict itself. So, back to the original agreement, he said. Let's have a North Korea and a South Korea. Totally get rid of the whole idea of just one Korean government. General MacArthur publicly criticized the president for this, however. He called him a coward, essentially. Truman then fired him for this. And this is going to be a bit of a problem because General MacArthur is going to have a lot of support. He's seen as a war hero back home. And so MacArthur is actually going to challenge Truman during a presidential race. He's going to lose poorly by then, but still this is going to divide the nation up. During 2 years of peace negotiations, the conflict carried on, resulting in 125,000 U.S. and UN casualties during the peace negotiations. By July the 26th, 1953, the final ceasefire came into effect. The war had cost America $20 billion and 33,000 lives. During this war, the Truman administration helped to rearm West Germany and also Italy. So we see that the Cold War has turned into a hot war. In Korea, it's been a very costly war. And by its end, it was very unpopular. Americans wanted out of it. Also, we were arming our allies in order to stop Soviet encroachment, which, I mean, the irony is, of course, is that we were at war with Italy and Germany not that long before this, but the whole idea was to build these places up, to keep them from being impoverished, and to keep them from turning into communist nations, which in turn would become our enemies. In Asia and the Pacific, American military stepped up its efforts to ward off Soviet influence, especially with our naval forces. So, as you recall, we've already had a Red Scare in the past in our American history course, but now we're going to see that it's going to flare up again following World War II. Domestically, the fight against communism was also ramped up following World War II. In 1947, Truman enacted the Federal Employment Loyalty Program. So the whole intention of this was to make sure that those people who had power within the government were loyal to Americans, and of course, not communist sympathizers, perhaps not spies, and things like that. And under this program, those who worked for the federal government could be fired on the grounds that they held disloyal feelings or actions to America. Both supervisors and federal employees accused one another of being disloyal to the country, leading to over 3,000 people being fired between 1947 and 1951. Under this order, the accused had no right to confront their accusers or to refute evidence held against them. Across America, many began to fear the enemy within as stories of Soviet sympathizers ran rampant. So, what we see here is that because of fear of communism, and also because of policy intentions in order to stay in office, the administration was trying to show that it was doing something to protect the homeland against communists. Now, we're going to talk more about this in our subsequent lectures, but please keep in mind that though these things are happening in America, you could magnify these actions in, say, Soviet Russia, in which not only did they have policies like this for their government employees, but also for the citizenry at large. In the Soviet Union, children would go to school and they were taught in school to tell on their parents so that their parents could be turned into the gulags and die of starvation or execution. So yes, we do have this dark period in our American past, but in comparison to the enemy, you have to keep in mind that it was still somewhat humane. In any case, we will pick that up next time. Thank you.